So let's talk a little bit about databases and what they are and how Access can be used to store and maintain data. So a database is basically an organized collection of related data. So it has to be organized in some way, and it has to be related. So related data would be, for example, student data, would be all the different information that a university might store about you, and it revolves around each particular student. It could be customer data, patient data, and could be product data, anything like that. It's organized in tables. So we have what we call tables, which will store the data, and it also allows you to set up what we call the structure of the table, which includes what type of data you might store in the table, the names of the fields of data, different things like that. So it allows you to organize it in a specific way. So Access is what we call a database management system, which allows you to store the data and manipulate it. You can manipulate it by updating it, maybe changing someone's address or their last name. It might be manipulating it in a way that you're pulling data from those tables. So if you have a question about, okay, so let's get a list of all of the students that have a 3.0 GPA or above and are majoring in business information technology. So a database management system allows you to do those types of activities. In Access, there are 4 types of objects that we'll talk about, which are tables, queries, forms, and reports. So we'll get to those a little bit later. A couple of things specific about Access to kind of forewarn you about before you get started. If you have a typical version of Microsoft Office, Access is not normally included unless it's maybe a professional version of Office. So the first thing you need to do is check and make sure you have Access on your computer. If not, there are other ways that you can get a copy or use a copy of Access, which we'll discuss outside of this video. So if you have a Mac, for example, there is no Mac version of Access, so you would have to use a Windows-based PC in order to utilize Access. When we talk about the file name extensions in Access, there are 2. So normally in Word, it's a .docx, for example. But in Access, there might be 2 different file name extensions. So if I open a file, it then creates what we call like a temporary file that has another extension. So the normal extension in Access is .accdb. When you have a file open in Access, it creates that temporary file that has a .laccdb, which is a locked database. So that means that the database is open and it prevents multiple people from trying to access and edit the same file or the same record at one time. So you can't all access the same piece of data and try to edit it at the same time. So you have to be very careful when you submit your assignments. You have to submit the .accdb, not the laccdb. Okay. Notice here in this screenshot, the .accdb file is pretty big compared to the .laccdb file, which is only 0K. So I can't open that .laccdb file. There will be nothing there. Okay. A couple of other things about Access. The undo does not always work, so just be very careful about that. When you save an Access, you can go to Save As, and there are different options. There's a Save Database As and Save Object As. Save Database will save everything. So whenever you click on Save or Save Database As, it saves all of the tables, all of the queries, all of the reports, and all of the forms. So you only have to save once, and it saves everything within the same file. Save Object As will save, for example, just one report or it will save just one query. And there are some other options here. For example, if you wanted to back up your database, you can do that under the Save As well. But the Save As works a little bit differently than in other applications. You'll also notice if you open a blank database in Access, it asks you to name the file up front. Whereas normally you could go into Word, you could create your letter, and then you could save it at the very end when you've completed everything. So not so much in Access. It will ask you to create the file and give it a file name, because as you work in Access, as you enter data, it will automatically save the data for you. So it needs to know what to save that data as when you're working through your files. So when you are working on a new database, you just want to plan everything and how to set it up. So I do have some instructions here on sort of the planning process. Generally, you're not going to be going into a company and creating a database from scratch. But you do need to know how to use a database, the underlying foundation concepts for how it works, and generally how a database maintains and stores data. So those will all be helpful to you in the future because you use databases on a daily basis. Okay. So generally, when we go into our Access objects, I'll talk a little bit about those, and then I will get into another video. I'll get actually into Access. Right now I just want to talk about the concepts. So tables are set up first. That's what holds your data, and it tells what type of data you will be storing in the database. So is it text? Is it numbers? Is it pictures? What type of data? So I've got some hints here about how you might want to create your tables and the different views. Once you've set up your tables, you'll create what we call relationships. It's how are those tables related together? Okay, so we'll talk about those a little bit later. In order to pull data from those tables, you're going to have the relationship set up correctly. Okay. The queries are set up and created so that you can pull data from the tables. Okay, so for example, going back to my previous example, if you wanted your students that have a 3.0 GPA or above, then and they are majoring in business IT, then you would create a query that would pull from the specific tables you need that particular information. Okay, so you can create these in different ways, and I can get into that in some different videos. So normally you don't want users going directly into your tables to edit data because they might find more data there than they need to see. Some of it might need to be kept more private. And you only want them to change specific data. So you don't want them to go in nilly-willy and start changing things in your tables. So you'll create forms, which are an interface to the tables. And in the form, when you create it, you can tell the form to show only specific fields and pieces of data that you want the user to be able to access and to change. The form will pull the data in from the table and display the data. And if the user changes anything data-wise in the form, it changes that data in the underlying table. So if, for example, I'm a student and I change my major from business IT to business analytics, then if I do that in the form, the underlying table that holds my student data will change my major also to business analytics. So the reports are usually just a summary of different types of information. A lot of times you'll pull reports from queries that you've created. Forms, a lot of times those come directly from tables, but they could also come from queries as well. So we'll have some other videos where I'll discuss those types of things. A few important concepts to remember, and then I'm going to create another video that you can watch about Access where we get into the Access software. So some database concepts. A field is a column in a table that holds one type of data. And then you have records that hold pieces of data as well. So for example, if I go into Access, so this is my customers table. So a field is a column. So I have a last name column. So that would be a last name field, a first name field, and so forth. So it looks very similar to an Excel spreadsheet, right? A row is considered to be a record, which is an instance for an example. This example is a customer, okay? So each customer has a record, which has values for each of those fields, okay? So you have your fields and your records. When you are setting up your database, creating new fields perhaps, or new forms, you want to make sure that you validate the data. So for example, if you want someone in a database to enter in someone's state where they live, do you want them to enter in the entire state? So for example, do you want them to type in Mississippi? Or do you want them to type in the 2-letter abbreviation? Okay, so think about it. What's the 2-letter abbreviation for Mississippi? So you could get lots of different answers for that when people type that in. They might type in MI or MS or MP. So when you do that, you might want to set up some kind of validation to make sure that they enter in an appropriate value. So you see a lot of times in a database, someone will create a drop-down list that has all of the states and their abbreviations, so you can just click on the one that you need, and that way you know you have a correct value. That's important because if you search for students by state later, you want to make sure that you're getting all of those students that actually live in that particular state. So we'll talk a little bit about relationships later, where you relate data from different tables. That's a very important concept in databases. So, and we'll also talk about tables having a unique primary key. Every table has to have something that's unique that identifies each record. So for example, in a student table, you might have a banner ID, for example, as a unique identifier for each student. We no longer use social security numbers, but you do have to have something unique for each record in that table. So that unique field is generally called the primary key for each table. When you create your relationships later, it's important that you have a primary unique key in every table because you will link the tables together through those primary key fields. Okay. Redundancy is very important to consider when you're creating databases and editing data in databases. You want to have the least amount of redundant or repeating data as possible. So, for example, if I have a student table with my basic student information that's about me, I might have my name and address and phone number and information like that. But let's say in the parking table, if I've purchased a parking tag, you don't need to repeat that information in the parking table, because then if I change my address, you're going to have to change it in both tables. So that gets to be a lot to keep up with. So in that case, you wanted to reduce the redundancy. And so therefore, in both tables, you might have my banner ID, which is the unique piece of information about me that will not change. So you could put that in the student table and the parking table. And that way, my parking tag number will be associated with my banner ID in that table. And that banner ID can be linked back to me in the student table. Okay, so a few things we'll revisit in some other videos, but those are some basic concepts that you need to remember about Access.